Yuka, why don't you just tell us who you are and what you do at Newton?
Yes. I mean, I would have been at Newton for I've been at Newton for almost 10 years. So I joined on February 4th. So that's coming up. Really approaching my 10th anniversary. I've been, within Newton, I started out as an equity research analyst, mostly covering Asia and also doing consumer and internet stuff. Always have been interested in consumer. In fact, I went to a French culinary school, so care very much about food. It is my biggest passion, I would say, apart from ballet, watching ballet, not performing ballet. When we launched this fund, we launched this fund in the UK last week, but we actually had a segregated mandate that's a non-UK client. And that launched about a year ago. We started conceptualizing this fund from about 2 years ago, and then, launched that mandate, and then now we've launched this mandate in the UK. So it's been, almost 2 years, I guess, since the initial planning of the fund. Like I said, I've always been interested in the consumer sector. I am a global sustainable global equity portfolio manager. That is my main job, but I also run some thematic funds for Newton. So I run this food innovation strategy, and I also have a longevity and what we call a future of Earth strategy. So that's more climate change oriented. Newton as a house, I'm sure you know very well, it's a very themes oriented house. And so a lot of these funds have been derived directly from our themes. And there's a lot of overlap in terms of the stocks that we own in these themed funds with the global sustainable equity fund that I also manage. So that's why I've been, assigned these funds. It all kind of generally falls under the same umbrella.
So if we look at the kind of, there's lots of terms used, things like food tech, ag tech,
yes,
kind of alternative proteins, cellular meat.
Yes.
This is a full industry for the jargon, yeah. From your viewpoint, what are the most interesting kind of trends that you're picking out? So obviously some of them you can't really invest in because there's not a lot of publicly listed businesses.
Yes.
But there are bits of it you probably can. What do you think, from your kind of helicopter view, are the most interesting things that investors need to watch out for in the coming food revolution?
So, like you mentioned, alternative proteins is definitely an area that we're keenly interested in. Maybe it's a bit easier if we break it down into the way we see the world. And we really, it's a really simple way of thinking, but we break it down between primary, secondary, and tertiary industries. So primary being, the seed manufacturers, also the, fertilizer companies, but also including ag machinery. And we feel like in that space, ag tech, if you like, is the most interesting. So, for example, there's a lot of sensor companies and chip manufacturers, and, also more kind of, the big integrated ag machinery producers or manufacturers that, are all basically trying to make agriculture more efficiently run, because it's one of those, along with construction, it's one of those sectors that are, hugely behind in terms of technology. So we like to look at companies, for example, that, have sensors and, and they run drones, for example, across the field. So these are like big plantation type farms that are, the majority in the US. But what's interesting is, like, for example, one sensor company can actually scan the color and the height of each plant, and then assess the growth or with the rate of what each plant is growing at, and administer the right amount of fertilizer. So that cuts back fertilizer consumption by about 10% on average, which is huge. And it's something that, a farmer can never do manually, right? Because he can't, I mean, he could, but it will take forever and it wouldn't be efficient and the crops would die out in the meantime. So it just doesn't make a lot of sense. So, that is definitely an area that we're really keenly interested in. And there's a lot of software technology, along with sensor technology in that space. So we have some exposure there. Moving on to the secondary industry. So these are the companies that actually produce the food. So, it can be your alternative protein producers, but an area that we also really like, which we think is a key growth area, are the ingredients companies,
Yeah.
and the flavor and fragrance companies.
Yeah.
Which have been, I think it's been an investor focus for a while now. I think, many investors really like this sector. But, all of those companies are shifting more to, more natural flavoring, or more natural fragrances, or, they might be the producers or they might be the suppliers to a lot of these alternative protein companies.
Yeah.
Another area that we're really interested in similar vein is probiotics.
Right.
So there's, companies out there that have a huge market share in producing yogurt cultures, for example.
Yeah.
And, these companies can do these things on an industrial scale and, basically provide to the likes of, like the Unilevers and the Nestle's of the world. And they provide a very sort of customized product. That's very
On that one of the, actually just touching on that issue, I'm interested to see what your take on this is.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for instance, on the alternative proteins, have you tasted any of the alternative meats, the Impossible Burgers, the Beyond Burgers?
Yes.
And what was your personal take on it? When you tasted them?
So I have only tasted Beyond and maybe meat. Yeah, I think I've done Meatless Farms as well.
Okay.
And I haven't had the chance to try Impossible, unfortunately. Although everyone says, the feedback is that, Impossible has the highest quality and the highest repeat ratio of customers. I would say that the way that they replicated the taste and the feel of meat is really impressive.
Right.
Like when you cook it on a frying pan, it actually chars, right? And then,
yeah.
It's like the meat juice kind of flows out, which is kind of weird.
But on that, because what I was going to say, so you actually think it's quite good, but one of the things I was interested, I was chatting to a few VCs in this space, and it struck me that you can kind of engineer the alternative plant-based proteins as much as you want to, but quite often, and I'm still a meat eater, so I still eat meat.
Yeah, I eat everything. So
yeah, exactly, same here. But actually, I find it quite often. I thought one of the most interesting areas was fats and oils, actually. And I was chatting away, and I was saying, actually, it strikes me that this is going to your point about flavorings, actually, that one of the most interesting areas is actually mixing kind of oils and fats that may well have been, for instance, cellular based, for instance. So it does actually originally come from an animal, yeah. And then you put it in the plant proteins, and you probably are getting damn close to the flavour of beef. I mean, is that because I have heard a lot of people say actually the oils, the fats, is that an interesting area that you've picked up on as well?
So not specifically oils and fats, and in terms of companies that we invest in. I think we do those through the flavor companies, to be honest.
And so just going back, so these flavoring companies, does that extend all the way to potentially these companies are fundamentally chemical companies, really, aren't they? I suppose enzyme chemical companies.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's interesting because if from a stock market perspective, it generally falls into the materials sector.
Yeah.
So we have a hard time explaining to our investors because, they see a high exposure to materials and they think, oh my God, what kind of chemicals are you invested in? And actually, in reality, these are more, they're on the edible side. Enzymes as well, like you say. I was talking to a Japanese convenience store about a year ago, and they were saying, well, you know what? Actually, some of these enzymes that they use can extend the life of their products, which basically means, and the enzymes actually disappear after a while. So it doesn't have any harm to the human body as far as they're concerned. And so what this implies is, typically at a Japanese convenience store, they used to deliver to all the stores 3 times a day, so breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Because they wanted to keep everything fresh. But then if things didn't sell by, if you deliver at lunch and then things don't sell by the time dinner comes around, they would basically throw out all those products and put in the new dinner products. So led to a lot of food waste. Whereas now with this sort of more natural approach to food longevity, if you like, they are able to extend the life and hence reduce food waste, which is ultimately good for the environment. So yeah, like really interesting innovation happening in that space.
So what else in the secondary and the primary space that you're interested in?
I guess I just mentioned most of the areas within primary and secondary. I'm just thinking there might have been one more thing. No, but I did mention probiotics, so I think that's it. Yeah. And then the final one is tertiary, which is more on the retail and consumer side. So I mean, the biggest growth area there is, as you know, online food delivery, which is, it's not just like bikes running around. It's about dark kitchens and assessing consumers' needs through AI. And so especially under COVID, there's loads of innovation going on there.
So going back to the stuff that's getting a lot of publicity, a lot of the alternative proteins.
Yeah.
Alternative proteins, the alternative meats. You're obviously aware there's plant-based and there's cellular-based. There are, I think there's one, Beyond, which is listed in the plant-based one. I think there's virtually nothing in the cellular. I mean, what do you make of that divide between cellular and plant? Plant-based obviously is in the market already there. Cellular, I think there's just one chicken product in Singapore that's been approved, so it's a few years away. What's your take on that kind of divide between cellular and plant-based?
Even though we're public equity investors, we do have a fair amount of opportunity to talk to some of these private companies, and a lot of brokers hold a lot of conferences in this space. I mean, I have spoken to a few. I will say that right now it's really fragmented, and it's really difficult to say because many of these products, like you say, haven't been commercialized yet. And the cost of that, a cost of a cellular burger, I think is, like it's like $100 or something like that.
I think Mosa Meat, apparently, is what you say, has now brought it down to about $9.
Okay. Sorry. No, mine was from like 6 months ago, so my data is very delayed. But I think the key is, and I do feel like the the Beyonds of the world are right in the sense that consumers, right, in order to, you have to mass produce these things. And so obviously like a 3-star Michelin chef can create a gourmet burger from cellular or, whatever it is, and sell it for 20 pounds or something like that. And that's all fine. But in order for it to make sense from a returns perspective, you need to really go en masse. And so it doesn't, at this point in time, what some of the alternative meat companies that are already out in the market are trying to do is to basically bring down the price of their products to either equivalent or below meat, which would really change the market radically. And right now, I think if you look at menus at KFC or Burger King or any of these fast food chains, for example, plant-based meat is priced at a slight premium. Now, and consumers don't seem to mind if it's like 10% or 20%. They're totally fine with it because I think they actually, I forget what the exact number was, but I think it was in the mid-teens of like the amount of customers ordering these meat alternatives out of Burger King or any of those fast food chains. And so it's actually quite high, and it's been received very well by the customer. But in order for it to really penetrate the market, the price really has to come down a little bit further. And then the ultimate aim of these meat companies is to be have their products be placed in the supermarket aisle next to the meats and not be in a separate section with all the kind of the original tofu burgers. So I do think that that's a key milestone. And with cellular, the price, like you say, the price has come down, but I don't think it's quite there yet. And I do feel like it's a bit tougher to commercialize, but it's coming. So over the next 10 years, you're just going to see huge penetration of these products into the market. I mean, right now, even with the introduction of Beyond and Impossible, this is like back in 2014. Prior to that, the plant-based meat market was basically stagnant. So these are your traditional bean and tofu burgers that were very obviously tofu-ish or very beanish. And then since those two came out, the CAGR for that type of product has increased to 18% year on year. So you can see that, clearly consumers are starting to adapt to this. And, if you take the US, for example, I mean, I'm sure you've heard of this before, but, vegans and vegetarians constitute about 6% of the market. And so those products were aimed at those people, but with the introduction of these more meat-like products, it's actually expanded the market to flexitarians, which are 25% of the market. So that's like 4 times the market size, and possibly growing even further. And so I think there's a lot of competitors, and I think a lot of them will be either competed out or be acquired by the big food companies as well. But right now we're at a point in the market where there's growth opportunities for everybody involved. And then once it reaches a certain market size and the market growth starts to slow down, then the competition will become fierce and there will be consolidation.
When do you think, and look, your guess is as good as mine, so none of us are experts. I've heard the term griddle point. So somebody said, that's the price point at which you go below the conventional meat. Yeah. Mm-hmm. When do you think that griddle point, so to speak, will be for plant-based meat, and then secondly for cellular-based meat? Mm-hmm. I mean, none of us know. It's just a guess. When do you think either or both of them will be? Next couple of years? Where do you think for plant-based?
I mean, for cellular-based, I can't really say because there's not that much data available in the market. But for plant-based meat, like Beyond or Impossible, I would say it's very, very soon. Yeah. Because already the premium is only 10 to 20%. It's come down.
And you mentioned there the big conventional food companies. Which of the big conventional food companies do you think are positioning themselves well for this, and which of the ones do you think where would you be worried about? So who's, because they're all quite a lot of them are getting into this world.
Yeah.
So but who do you think's doing a really good job of it? Who do you think's more vulnerable?
So the only other formidable competitor to Beyond and Impossible that I have, heard from various sources that has a comparable product is Nestle. And I've, heard results of blind tasting tests and so on and so forth. And even then, apparently it doesn't really come close. So I think there's still, you have to, big food companies have a lot of cash and they have a lot of R&D spending power, but at the same time, they have their incumbent businesses. And I'm not saying they have their incumbent meat businesses. What I'm saying is, they're a big conglomerate, and so they have to allocate their cash. And sometimes they can't focus 100% on a new product area, even though it might have really rapid growth. And so in that sense, are the big food companies going to eat up the smaller ones? Maybe in some cases, but it's not always the case. I think what would be most important competitively is the ability to, well, first of all, have the product quality be good enough to capture the attention of a lot of the restaurant chains or the QSRs, as we call it, so the fast food chains. And secondly is, I think this is the most important, but the ability to have the production level in place to be able to continuously supply those goods to their customers. So supply chain is really important, and build the speed that widget build-up factories and stuff. That is, the execution is really key.
We talk about the market for food as one global market, but that's probably not true, really. There's a kind of Western European and American market, and then there's an Asian market. And I think it's very interesting that the first cellular meat on the main consumer market was licensed to Singapore, a chicken-based product. And then there's the massive Chinese market, and then there's the different Japanese market, which has got its own unique characteristics. Everybody, whenever anybody talks about any disruptive sector, inevitably people talk about Asia and talk about China, and China has got a bigger focus on things like pork and fish. Are there any particular dynamics we should watch out for in Asia, which maybe slightly differentiates itself compared to the Western European and North American markets?
Well, the way that I tend to look at it in terms of developed versus emerging markets. As you know, in China, meat consumption is this is just natural part of increase in GDP leading to people consuming more meat. And that's a trend that we've seen for many, many years. So, the consumption of pork belly in China just keeps on going up. And I just don't, I don't think that trend is going to subside anytime soon or be replaced per se by alternative meats. But having said that, China is one of the biggest markets, growth markets in terms of alternative meat as well. So I think that there is definitely an appetite for consumers to go into that. Also, if you look at alternative milks, China has always historically had plant-based milk. They drink loads of soy milk. So I don't think that product category is any, it's not something that's unapproachable to them at all. If anything, maybe they were, perhaps at the forefront of it from, many thousands of years ago. So it's not, definitely similar trends to what we see in the Western world also applies to Asia. The pace might be slightly different, or the stage that they're in might be slightly different, or, there's some product preferences, like, Asians tend to prefer tea or, green tea, and there's a big market for that. That's a growth opportunity for some of the Japanese beverage companies, for example, or, some of the Chinese ones as well. And so obviously every region is different. It's different and the same at the same time. So it's, there's obviously this, consumers have, I think one of the key trends that we do see across the globe is the ability for the consumer to have more access to information via the internet. Right. And that's true regardless of what country you're in. So, a lot of Chinese people, for example, care deeply about where their food is sourced. Perhaps that's because they have a history of, not really knowing what they're eating. And they really they really care about their health, and they really care about where their products come from. So brand for them, is very, very important, for example. And with WeChat and all the information available online, they have more access to that, which allows them to make better decisions, which is, kind of similar to what you see in the US, like you see, or US or the Western Europe. It's kind of like, right now you see, if you go online, tons of information on where the products are being sourced and whether they're actually organic or not, or, where what the carbon footprint of a product is. And I think consumers are becoming more and more aware and, scrutinizing, where does this blueberry come from? Like, does it come from Peru? Why are they shipping blueberries from Peru to London? Like, that's a huge carbon footprint, and it just doesn't make a lot of sense anymore. And so, there definitely is kind of like an underlying global trend towards more transparency.
What do you think? There's been, just finishing off, there's been the beginnings of an IPO boom. We've Beyond's on the market. We saw late last year a company called Novus Capital come on the market, which are doing circular farms, so effectively greenhouses, more modern form of greenhouses. Do you think we're likely to see more IPOs? Are you hearing on the grapevine any sense that we're likely to see quite a lot more IPOs? There's rumours about Blue Nalu, which is a big fish alternative fish coming out possibly this year.
And Oatly, possibly.
Sorry?
Oatly as well, possibly.
Oatly, absolutely, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Yes.
Do you sense that we're likely to see many more this year, or do you still think we're a couple of years away from the real boom in it?
That's a really interesting question. I am not. I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah, no, none of us are.
I'm not an expert in that space. I mean, you know, it's. I think that it's very, you know, IPOs are very market driven. So if the stock market is doing well, then you know that would obviously point towards more IPOs and consumer. You know, the VCs investing in the consumer space has been a big trend over the past few years, apart from, you know, all the software IPOs and stuff that we've seen. So yeah, I mean, yeah, definitely. I don't know if it'll surpass other areas in VC land per se, but yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely some companies that some VCs hold that could list over the next year or two.
And if somebody like Oatly came to the market, I mean, very successful along with Alpro in the alternatives milks market, is that the kind of business that you'd look to invest in?
I think it's really, really valuation dependent.
Yeah.
It's really hard to find a comparable, I think, because WhiteWave was purchased by, I think it was purchased by Danone back in 2017. And we thought that it was a really expensive transaction back then. But now I think all the multiples look quite cheap in comparison to other, you know, innovative food companies that we see. So, yeah, I mean, if you, you know, if you have a good product, and I think if you have a good roadmap for growth, and you've already proven that you can build top line, then yeah, I think if the markets continue to do well in the way that they've done over the past year, you do have a very good story to sell to the market.
And just going back to the beginning, and as we finish off the ag tech thing, I mean, what names are there in that space? Because most people have heard of Beyond, yeah. You know, they might have heard of Oatly, you know, but actually in the ag tech space, most people haven't heard of virtually anything in that space. What names are lurking around in that space?
Well, I can't directly tell you individual stock names, but what I can say is all the ag machinery names. So like any ag machinery name that you think of is very involved in this space. Right. And then there's sensor companies out there and chip companies, which might not be very obvious, but names that you would have heard of that are, you know, have a, you know, good proportion of revenues going into ag tech. Okay, so cool. Yeah, we try to, you know, I mean, we need, you know, we can't invest in a company that only has, you know, 5% exposure to ag tech, but if it's, you know, significant levels, then we can go in and invest. So we kind of try to look for niche areas like that, because a lot of the very obvious names like Beyond have just, you know, the valuations have blown out. So
well, one last thing, a lot of people talk to me and say plant biotech is an interesting area. They go, you know, next gen, obviously biotech's a big industry, lots of listed names, and people do mention plant biotech as the kind of next, the new thing. Yeah. Does that ring a bell with you? Have you been hearing any names in the plant biotech sector, or is it still too early?
I think it's still, well, too early for us, definitely. You know, and I think in terms of interest, I mean, you know, maybe not necessarily kind of directly about biotech, but we've heard of, you know, for example, really interesting companies that deal with algae in terms of animal feed, but also in terms of an alternative to, you know, vegetables, basically, as well. So, you know, there are new products that are constantly coming out, and, you know, new innovations constantly happening. But, you know, I mean, we're keeping an eye on it. But don't see any like kind of listed companies or, you know, pre-IPO companies right now at the moment.
Great. Thank you very much, Yuka. Thank you.
Thank you.